So hey guys, welcome back to my channel. And it has been a while. A lot of things have been happening in my life, like one after the other. This is also a crazy year where I'm preparing for my visa. So anyway, like long story short, I'm back. And if you haven't done so, you can vote on future video topics under my post. And right now, the topic that stood out is the inferior cultural function. And I know I like to talk a lot about culture and society in my channel. And I think this is no surprise if you know about instincts. I have a social instinct, right? So I'm very aware of how, psychology affects society and vice versa. And the topic of inferior cultural functions, I feel, has not come up a lot in channels of other creators or even as a theory in itself. I do have another video that's about, MBTI of countries, and I think that's a related video that you can get a lot of. And as usual, this channel is all about psychology. I do delve in a lot into Jungian psychology as well as a bit of theories from Freud, MBTI, Enneagram type, and learning self growth and self discovery through the process. And inferior cultural functions, well, if you're familiar, right, when I'm talking about the MBTI functions, right? So Myers-Briggs, right, we all have four main functions, right? For me, INFJ, I lead with introverted intuition, so that's my dominant function. And I basically have a last or inferior function that's called extroverted sensing. And extrovert sensing is sort of there, but a little bit in the shadow, right? If you know the concept of Carl Jung's shadow self, the shadow self is this part of you that you have disowned or repressed to a certain degree, right? So a lot of times our inferior function is something that we have, but we don't fully use, and we are sort of grappling with it, right? In stressful times, it comes up. So there is a shadowy quality to our inferior function because it is a part of us. We care about it, but we have disowned it to some degree or repressed it, right? So, yeah. So the inferior function, that's the personal inferior function that most people in the MBTI community who know about cognitive functions are aware of. And if you don't, you can Google your own personality type and find out what your functions are. And the last one is the inferior function, right? What are cultural inferior functions? So cultural inferior functions are basically the same thing, except that it pertains to a specific culture or country, right? So that's why the video about MBTI of countries comes in handy, because that's the one that basically types, countries and societies into personality types. And so the inferior function, or sometimes even the tertiary function, right, of the country that you grew up in or the culture that you grew up in is going to be the so-called inferior cultural function. So how does it work together with your personal inferior function? So I have a very interesting theory, and this is based on my observations for many years of myself and others, that yes, of course, we all have a personal inferior function, right? But we also have a cultural inferior function. And both of them are actually in our shadows. And I know this is not, this might not be what people expect to hear, because it's like, oh, well, I'm just looking at my own functions. What does it matter about the cultural inferior function? What does that mean? But it's like whatever your culture represses, you also repress within yourself, because as I have reiterated in my other videos about culture and society, we are all social animals. Even if at the end of the day we are very individualistic, and I come from a very individualistic background, like, I mean, my Enneagram type is, I have a 4, type 4, and that's very individualistic. But even I am impacted by culture, right? Everybody is impacted by culture. It's impossible not to be. The place that you're born in, your parents' culture, it influences your personality. Yeah. So at the end of the day, if they repress something, you're going to repress something. And I'm going to go into that in depth with the Freud's, daddy and mommy issues thing in my other video that people were voting on as well. But for this video, cut it short, right? Parents pass down certain repressions, culture passes down, similar repressions. And so if your culture has a inferior function, chances are you're going to have it too, even if that function actually appears in your you know main function stack, right? You still repress it because your culture you know downgrades it. So in order to get love, right, we human beings, we want to belong, especially as children. We want to try to assimilate, right? So I'm going to give you an example so it's not as theoretical and unclear. So we all know what is a personal inferior function, hopefully, but the cultural one. So I'm gonna use my own example, right? I was born into an ESTJ culture. China is very ESTJ. My mom is ESTJ, right? So ESTJs, what do they lead with? They lead with extroverted thinking, right? They have introvert sensing as a second function, and then they have extroverted intuition, then followed by introverted feeling, right? So my the culture that I grew up in is very heavy on the first two, right? Extroverted thinking and introverted sensing. And then the culture that my family moved to is very ISTJ. Um, and so it's Singapore, and they were colonized by UK, which I believe is also ISTJ. So it's like very, both are ISTJ cultures that we are experiencing. So it's background ESTJ, ISTJ, okay? So yes, I don't, if you look at INFJ's functions, oh, where's the extroverted thinking? I don't seem to have it. But because my culture is very heavily leaning towards extroverted thinking, and my family, right? So extrovert thinking actually became a part of me from a very young age. Even though you can argue, oh, it's not the kind of extrovert thinking that, ENTJs and ESTJs are, using, but it is steeped in the culture. So you can't, like, your logic is informed by that. Your viewpoints, your right opinions, your worldviews are impacted by extroverted thinking. And I'm not saying that it's all wrong or all right, right? It's always, I believe every function has its purpose and value, right? The only issue is when certain functions are too dominant, right, in a society, and then you start craving the shadow aspects, right? You start realizing, oh, I need the other sides. Like, where do I get the other, repressed parts? So my society heavily represses extroverted intuition and introverted feeling. What does that mean? There's a very little to no encouragement of entrepreneurship, except maybe among younger generations. But even then, it's a very like non-mature state. Okay, it's different from US where there's a lot more entrepreneurs here. But over there, it's like 9 to 5 is the norm. That's what you have to do, right? Very stable jobs. Entrepreneurship is kind of looked down on, or people don't really get it, or there's very little variety of entrepreneurships that you can do. It's always like drop shipping or like comedy videos, right? Very little like psychology channels can even survive there. And extroverted intuition is also repressed. So like things like having, innovation, right? Multiple possibilities. Multiple possibilities repressed, meaning people think, okay, to have a good life, you have to just do the thing that everybody does. Okay, you have to get married at a certain age, have to have kids, have to just be like, do your thing that you're supposed to do, have certain careers that are, designated to you, right? Things that people kind of stereotype as Asian culture, right? Um, and introvert feeling is repressed. So that means how you feel, right? How I feel is repressed. It's very rare for you to hear, at least in my household, like I feel this, right? That's like nobody says that, okay? It's like I think this is very common. I feel this, not really, right? It's like imagine if a parent say something and you're like, oh my god, I feel so hurt, or I feel so disappointed, or I feel very like whatever, fill in the blanks, right? I feel upset when you did this. No, nobody says that. Okay, it's very unusual. Okay, and people will be like, you're too sensitive, right? If you say that, you're too sensitive. So introverted feeling is repressed. Extroverted intuition is repressed. So, and this society doesn't really have extroverted sensing as a very dominant trait either, right? So extroverted sensing is my own inferior function. So yes, I will be kind of drawn to that. At the same time, though, I'm also kind of seeking, you know, more introverted feeling. And I noticed this tendency in myself, right? It's like, yes, I have, you know, inferior extroverted sensing, and so I do tend to gravitate towards environments with more extroverted sensing to kind of make a balance out of myself. Now, not too much extroverted sensing, right? But some extroverted sensing is kind of welcomed, um, because that's the function that like helps you to live in a moment, and I tend to be less good at that sometimes. Better now, but still kind of working on it. But then I realize I also have a tendency of gravitating towards environments that have introverted feeling. And that's interesting because you may think, oh, I'm a feeling type, right? Yes, I don't use introvert feeling, I use extrovert feeling, but generally speaking, like if you grow up in a culture where introverted feeling is celebrated, which is not very common, I would say, but then like as a feeling type, you may not feel the need to go towards places where introverted feeling is celebrated, or even people, right? My two best friends are both introverted feeling users. One of them is INFP, the other one is either ESFP or ISFP. She's kind of in between. Um, and I'm like, that's very interesting because how come I'm not gravitating towards introverted thinking people? That's like by the logic of MBTI, right? It's like, oh, you should be gravitating towards the people with your inferior functions and your tertiary function. And I have introverted thinking, right? Well, the reason is because my culture and my family is full of thinking people. My dad is, INTP, mom ESTJ. My whole culture is very, very logical, structured type of culture, right? So to me, I think introverted thinking is not something I need to work on, in my opinion. I'm pretty good at it, okay? And like it's like as good as my extrovert feeling might even be better, because of the culture and how many like thinking types there are. And so I don't really have an issue with it. And so interestingly, I also noticed that in my INFP friend who is from China, she actually is very good at extroverted thinking, even though she's an INFP. People think, INFPs are supposed to be a little bit like less structured, a little bit like not really sure how to make plans type of people. Okay, I'm making a stereotype, right? Or like too immersed in their emotions and no structure, whatever. She's actually very good at extroverted thinking compared to NFPs that I meet in the US. Okay, I'm just saying relatively speaking. And she was in a prestigious job position for many years, six figures. And that's a very extroverted thinking thing to value, right? Extroverted thinking, dominant people are all about external achievements and external results. That's what they value. And to a certain degree, I think that's what I value as well because I grew up in that culture, right? Um, but I also noticed in my INFP friend from China and also me, we both actually struggle with introverted feeling, which is ironic because she's an INFP and she shouldn't be struggling with her dominant function. But the reason why we struggle with it is because of culture, right? Because there is a stoic nature to the ESTJ culture, where saying things like I feel this, I feel that is just generally going to be dismissed, right? um, Feeling types, especially I think intuitive feeling types, are just considered like way too overwhelming for the, STJ dominant population. So you can see how culture plays a role in the types of functions that you repress, that you are not fully in attunement with, okay, or not fully valuing within yourself. Um, so this can be different for everybody. Okay, in some cases, people experience the opposite. I actually know a lot of people in America that the way you see it also is through the idealization or romanticization of other cultures, right? Like, of course, it can be a little bit extreme in some degrees, and that's unhealthy. But I think in general, if you're drawn to a certain culture and you don't know why, it's usually because they're part of your shadow. Like, a lot of Americans are drawn to Asian cultures, and it could be different kinds of Asian cultures, but at the end of the day, Asian cultures are very STJ in general. Um, so just look at Korea, Japan. They're also, I think Korea is SFJ. Japan is kind of, also STJ if you're looking at the work culture. Maybe a bit of SFJ in entertainment. Generally, I would say, Asian cultures tend to be SJ types of culture. With, sometimes because of the repression, they actually have amazing introverted feeling and intuitive qualities in their writings because it's like repressed, right? So it kind of comes out in the arts in very like amazing, abundant ways. So that can also kind of emerge because that's their shadow, right? But in general, if you find yourself idolizing or romanticizing another culture, it's because they provide you with something that you are not able to grasp, right, in your upbringing, right? So for example, America is ESTP, right? And so um, ESTP's inferior function is introverted intuition, and that's kind of like that's a very rare, to be honest, it's a rare dominant function of any culture. So probably very hard to find a country with INFJ values. I don't know which country has INFJ values. I think France is maybe ISFP, right? That's like close enough, but not really. Um, so and then right, if you're talking about Latin American culture or so-called like Black American culture, it's very extroverted sensing too, right? In my observation, okay, correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm not part of that culture, but just from my observation, I think Latin American culture, a lot of it is very ESFP, and for the Black American culture is very ESFP, ESTP. Okay, a lot of extroverted sensing. So even if you're not an ESTP, right? That's what I notice in both Latin American and Black cultures. Even if you're not ESFP or ESTP, you are going to have extroverted sensing qualities, and it's going to be much stronger in people who grew up in that culture than people who have not. So, for example, you can both be INFJ, you can be an INFJ Asian person who has grown up in China versus an INFJ um, person who grew up in either Latin American culture or Black American culture. You will notice, at least from my experience, that the person who grew up in a Latin American or Black culture are going to have a lot more extroverted sensing qualities. They are going to value things like sports, against, I know it's stereotypes, but you know what I mean, combat sports, um, a lot of these like athletic things because it's highly valued in that culture. People get really good at it, like more assertive, more sort of like, I made this decision, I'm going to stand by it, and I'm going to like be taking action, towards what I want. Like those are very extroverted sensing qualities. Um, anyway, so what I'm trying to say is your culture, right? If your culture represses certain qualities, let's say if your culture doesn't, value introverted intuition, but values tons of extroverted sensing, then introverted intuition may be part of your shadow too. Okay, and also, right, if your culture doesn't value, the opposite of like, maybe your culture doesn't value extroverted thinking, and then you see a culture that values extroverted thinking because that's what you lack, right? Extroverted thinking has good qualities too. It has structure, right? It has resilience. It teaches you to be an overachiever, but sometimes that's a good thing, right? Sometimes it's good to want to achieve things. It teaches you to value outputs and to see if your efforts are coming to fruition. And there is a persistence and determination that's very attractive. And so you could be drawn to cultures with that quality too, right? So that's when we talk about why do some people start traveling, and they talk about wanting to live somewhere. That may or may not be the right decision for you, right? Sometimes you may over romanticize a place, and then when you live there you're like, oh, actually they have a lot of issues over there too, right? But sometimes it could be a healing decision, and that's different from everybody. Yeah. So you kind of have to feel it out. You have to experience it to see if it's going to be healing or not. Lastly, I want to touch on how do you integrate. Okay, so back to the whole like individuation process by Carl Jung. He talks a lot about it in his book Man and His Symbols. By the way, I started a physical Man and His Symbols book club in Los Angeles, and we already had 2 sessions with a lot of attendance, and it went really well. And I'm hoping to bring it to the online community as well. If you want to join my Patreon, I'm going to be reading Men and His Symbols virtually as well. We are going to go chapter by chapter, and I will let you know once we have a few members which chapters we're going to be starting with and the timing we are going to be voting on it. So head to my Patreon to find out how you can join. So Carl Jung's individuation process indicates that we have to try to integrate, right, our shadow self in order to become whole. And we are not trying to self-improve. We are trying to just discover more sides of us. So it's already in us. It's already in there, right? So for example, my culture, because it's so good at extroverted thinking, introverted thinking, all the thinking stuff, like, but I have a lot of feelings too, right? So introverted feeling is already there. I just have to integrate it. And how do you integrate your culture's inferior function? So you look at what your culture values and doesn't value. And then the things that don't value, sometimes it may trigger you, yeah? But you kind of have to look at it more objectively and see what positive qualities can come out of it. For example, for my culture, they value hyper productivity, hyper efficiency. You have to show visible results all the time. They don't like to see failure of any kinds. They want to see you making money and just achieving things all the time. So what is the shadow side of that? It's like, what about individuality, right? What about what I want to do? What about flexibility? What about rest, right? Rest is kind of seen as laziness. What about what about the value of failure? Because failure can be valuable. If I care about being a perfectionist all the time, this YouTube channel will never be done. Yeah, because you always have to learn from your mistakes, especially in entrepreneurship. You will never get it all right. Even if you want to, you would spend 10 years on the first video, it will still turn out wrong, right? You kind of learn from your mistakes. That's valuable. And introverted feeling qualities that were suppressed, right? Things like, feelings. When do feelings matter? They do matter in some situations, yeah. Like, you can't always prioritize introvert feeling, because I do see the value of extroverted thinking too. And that's also when you come to integrate, you are not bashing everything that you learn from your culture. You are not bashing everything that you learn from other cultures. You are kind of bring them together for balance, right? Like everything that I learned from my culture, there are great things that I've learned. Things like being responsible, being accountable, things like discipline. Honestly, I kind of have to work on that even more sometimes. Things like consistency, right? Those are amazing qualities. And things like resilience, those are amazing qualities. But at the same time, there's also other valuable things that I learned from other cultures. and then you integrate them. So when you come from a healthier place, you're not going to be throwing things out that you have learned from your culture entirely, because there are things that are going to be helpful and valuable, but you are also not overly glorifying the other culture or overly criticizing the other culture, right? You are integrating by putting them together, kind of meeting people in the middle. This is the same thing with relationships, right? Or friendships or whatever. When you see people with your shadow qualities, you kind of can tell usually by the fact that they keep appearing in your life, right? Sometimes you might be annoyed, sometimes you might be idolizing them, right? Depending on which quality, but usually both indicate that they are part of your either your own shadow, your personal inferior function, or your cultural inferior function. And what you can do is you try to integrate them in your life. How can I become I wouldn't say a better person, but like more like closer to my real self, right? By integrating these shadow qualities, like things that I admire in other people, or things that I even find annoying in other people, but they could be a positive. Like, are there areas in my life where I need to be, you know, a little bit different from my how I usually act? Like, if you are a super structured person, do you need to learn flexibility? If you are a super flexible person, do you need to learn some routine, right? It's all about meeting in the middle. I think that's integration, and knowing what belongs and what can be discarded. So hope this video helps, and as usual, if you want to support my channel, you can give it a thumbs up, you can share it on your social media channel, join my Patreon, link below, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.